The blizzard came out of nowhere. One moment, the sky was clear and the world was peaceful. And the next, a wall of snow swept across the mountainside, turning the entire landscape into a white abyss. The wind howled like a living thing, pulling at my clothes, biting at my skin. I had been hiking up the ridge, my goal being to reach a small cabin where I planned to wait out the storm. But as the snow grew heavier, I lost my way. I shouldn't have wandered so far from the trail. The thought nagged at the back of my mind, but it was already too late to turn back. My feet were heavy with the cold, and the snow beneath me was thickening quickly. My breaths were shallow, the cold air burning my lungs with every inhale. I could barely see my hand in front of my face, the wind and snow closing in from every direction. I pulled my scarf tighter around my face and kept moving, knowing that if I didn't find shelter, soon I'd be in trouble. It wasn't the first time I'd been caught in a storm, but the intensity of this one was something else. It felt wrong. The snow wasn't just falling, it was alive, swirling around me like it had a purpose, as though something was watching. Then I heard it, a laugh. A soft, high-pitched giggle, echoing through the blizzard. It was so clear, so bright amidst the roaring wind, that for a moment I stopped in my tracks. The sound was innocent, almost playful, like a child's laugh on a crisp winter morning. I glanced around, but the world was nothing but swirling snow and shadow. The laugh came. Again, a little louder this time, but no one was visible. There was no child in sight, no sign of anything unusual, except for the unsettling feeling that I was not alone. "Hello," I called out, my voice swallowed by the wind. I strained my eyes, searching for any movement in the whiteness. Nothing. No footprints, no movement. Just endless snow falling and the sound of that laugh, like it was carried on the wind itself. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart racing. The laugh came again, and this time it was different, more joyful, almost mocking, like it was teasing me. My breath caught in my throat. There was something about it that felt wrong, as though the child wasn't laughing with me but at me. I felt a sudden urge to run, to find shelter, but the laugh seemed to chase me, echoing in my ears, getting louder with every step. I stumbled forward, trying to ignore the icy fingers creeping into my bones, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that settled deep within me. But I couldn't escape the sound. It grew louder, closer. I glanced behind me, but there was nothing. The blizzard had completely obscured my path, and I couldn't even see my footprints anymore. It was as if the snow had erased all traces of me. The laugh sounded so real now, so close, that it almost felt like the child was right behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see a small figure standing in the snow, but there was nothing. The laugh stopped. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, listening intently to the silence that had taken over. For a few moments, the only sound was the howling wind. The snow had thickened so much that it felt like I was walking through a dream, the world muffled and distant. But then the laugh came again. This time it was low, almost a whisper, as though the child was speaking directly into my ear. It wasn't playful anymore. It was sad. "You can't leave. There." The voice was clear, but the words were hollow, like they came from a place where no warmth existed. I whipped around, but again, there was nothing. Just the snow, falling relentlessly from the sky. A wave of panic surged through me. I had to get out of here. I had to find shelter. The storm was getting worse, and the child's voice was like a magnet, pulling me deeper into the blizzard. But as much as I wanted to run, something held me back, something in the voice, something in the way the laugh echoed in my mind. Without thinking, I started walking again, my steps hurried and erratic, my mind focused solely on finding shelter. The child's laughter still rang in my ears, but I couldn't stop. I had to escape. And then, just as I was beginning to think the world was closing in on me, I saw it, a small silhouette in the distance. A cabin. My heart surged with hope. I ran toward it, my legs aching, my chest tight with exhaustion. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the dim glow of a fire inside. I shoved the door open and stumbled into the warmth, my body trembling from the cold. The cabin was small but well kept, the fire crackling in the hearth. There was a single chair by the fire and a small table with a single lamp. But there was no one there. The door slammed shut behind me, the wind howling in protest. I turned, my pulse racing to find myself alone in the dim light. But the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt alive, like it had been waiting for me. I could still hear the child's laugh echoing in the corners of the room. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside. I dropped to my knees by the fire, my hands shaking as I tried to warm myself, but no matter how close I sat to the flames, the cold wouldn't leave me. I looked around, my eyes searching every corner of the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone. Only the flickering shadows dancing on the walls. The laugh continued, growing louder, closer, until it felt like it was coming from right behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing, just the empty space of the room. I stood up, my heart thundering in my chest, and looked around the cabin one last time. The fire crackled softly, the laughter faded into the background. But I knew something wasn't right. The storm outside raged on, but the blizzard had stopped. And in the stillness of the cabin, I realized I wasn't alone after all. The laugh wasn't gone. It had just gotten quieter, as if it was waiting for something, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I slowly backed toward the door, but it was too late. I could feel the presence closing in around me, the weight of it pressing against my chest. The child was here, inside with me. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to escape, I would never get away. As the last of the warmth in the cabin faded, I heard the voice again, soft and distant, just over my shoulder. "You're mine now." And with that, the blizzard took me once more. The night had settled over my house like a heavy blanket, the silence outside broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling into the cold. I had just finished dinner, a simple meal of soup and bread, and was now curled up on the couch with a book. The fire in the living room crackled softly, its warmth a welcome relief from the biting chill of the winter evening. It was quiet, too quiet. My house was on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. The kind of place where you don't hear the hum of passing cars or the sounds of neighbors going about their business. Just the wind rustling the trees and the occasional bark of a dog miles away. That's why when I heard the faint sound of something tapping on my door, it froze me in place. I wasn't expecting anyone. There were no neighbors close enough to just drop by unannounced. I slowly set my book down and got up from the couch, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The tapping continued, steady and persistent. I approached the door cautiously, my heart beating faster with every step. I peered through the peephole but saw nothing, just the darkness of the yard stretching out before me. The wind had picked up, swirling the snow around in chaotic gusts. I hesitated for a moment, but the tapping persisted. Something about it felt off, like it was deliberate, not like the wind or some animal scratching at the door. I opened the door slightly, just enough to peek outside. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face, and I shivered, but there was no one in sight. The porch light cast an eerie glow on the snow-covered ground, but there was nothing moving, no sign of anyone standing in the shadows. I was about to close the door when my eyes caught something on the ground. Footprints, fresh ones. They led up to my door from the edge of the porch. The prints were deep in the snow, like someone had walked right up to my house in the middle of the storm. But there was something wrong with them. The shape of the prints wasn't like anyone I knew. They were too wide, too odd, like they didn't belong to a human at all. They were irregular, almost as if something had dragged its feet, leaving behind these strange, uneven marks in the snow. The prints led directly to my door, stopping right in front of it. I felt my heart skip a beat. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me, but the feeling of unease lingered. I backed away from the door, my eyes still glued to the window, watching the footprints through the frosted glass. They weren't there just a moment ago. How could they have appeared so suddenly? My mind raced with explanations, but none of them made sense. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe someone had come up the path. But the footprints didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. And why hadn't I heard any sound? No crunching of snow beneath boots, no rustling of a coat or breath in the cold air. I tried to shake the thought, but the unease gnawed at me. I turned away from the door and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. But every time I thought about it, my mind would return to those footprints. They were too strange, too purposeful. Whoever, whatever had left them had come for a reason. I grabbed my phone and called my neighbor, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, but there was no answer. It wasn't like him to be unreachable, especially not when the weather was this bad. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the windows, making the walls creak and groan as though the house itself was under pressure. I glanced back at the door, my mind conjuring up more and more scenarios. What if someone was out there watching me? What if those footprints weren't just random at all? I paced the living room, my nerves on edge, and then suddenly, the tapping came again. This time, it was on the window next to the door. I froze. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap. It wasn't a gust of wind or the shifting of branches. It was too exact, too intentional. I slowly turned toward the window. The world outside was a blur of white, snowflakes swirling in the gusts of wind, the night sky dark and empty. But then I saw something, just barely visible in the shadows beyond the porch light. A figure. Tall, thin, standing in the snow, watching my house. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch against the wind or the cold. It just stood there, unmoving, as if it were waiting for something, waiting for me. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing, and then, without thinking, I ran to the back door, hoping to find another way out. I couldn't stay here, not with that thing outside. I was scared, truly scared for the first time in a long while. The wind howled through the cracks in the faria door as I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking. But when I opened the back door and stepped into the yard, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The footprints. They were there, too. A trail of deep, uneven prints, leading from the edge of my yard right up to the back door. The same strange, irregular marks that had appeared in front of my front door. Only this time they seemed to stretch far beyond my porch, disappearing into the darkness of the trees. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my mind spinning. The cold was beginning to seep in, but the warmth of the house was the least of my concerns now. I had no idea what was out there, but I knew one thing for certain. The footprints were not a coincidence. Whoever or whatever had left them was not human, and they were here for a reason. I grabbed the phone again and dialed my neighbor, but there was still no answer. Panic surged through me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this house, not with the strange footprints, not with the sense that something was waiting for me just beyond the walls. I moved to the windows again, watching the storm rage outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was gone now, but the footprints remained. Everywhere. The snow seemed to shift as if they were being dragged across the yard, leading to every corner of the house. I wasn't alone, and whatever was out there had been here for much longer than I realized. The tapping began again. This time, it was at the door. The storm had come out of nowhere. 1 minute, The sky was clear. The next, dark clouds had swept in, blanketing everything in a thick curtain of white. The wind picked up quickly, howling through the trees as snowflakes battered against my face. I had been out in the wilderness, hiking through the frozen expanse of the mountains when the blizzard hit. With no shelter in sight, I had no choice but to seek refuge. I stumbled through the blinding snow, eyes squinting against the sharp sting of the wind, desperately searching for anything that could provide cover. That's when I saw an igloo half buried in the snow, its entrance barely visible against the snowdrift. It looked old, neglected, but it was shelter. And at that moment, it was all I could think about. I made my way toward it, the snow deepening with each step, my legs growing heavier and colder. The wind howled around me, almost deafening in its intensity. I reached the igloo and ducked inside, gasping for air as I pulled myself through the small opening. The interior was dark and cold, but it was better than being outside. The walls of the igloo were made of thick, compacted snow and ice, the structure surprisingly solid despite its apparent age. I pressed my back against the wall and sank to the floor, trying to catch my breath. My fingers were numb, my face red and stinging from the cold, but at least I was out of the storm. I took a moment to collect myself, my heart still racing from the frantic run through the snow. I was safe, for now. But something about the place made me uneasy. It felt wrong, as if I wasn't truly alone in here. I glanced around the igloo, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The space was small, barely enough room for me to sit up straight. But what caught my attention was something in the far corner. It wasn't a pile of snow or ice. It was a shape. A dark shape. I blinked, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was still there. A person? Pain. I stood up slowly, my heart skipping a beat. The figure was slumped against the far wall, barely visible in the dim light. My pulse quickened. Was it a body? I swallowed hard, the air in the igloo suddenly feeling too thick, too heavy. I crept closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As I drew nearer, I realized with a jolt that it wasn't a body at all. It was a pile of clothes, dirty and worn, bundled up in the corner. But there was something wrong about it. The clothes looked recent. Too recent to be abandoned for long. I stepped closer, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The storm outside had become a roar, the wind howling through the small opening in the igloo. But inside, it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. My footsteps made no sound on the frozen ground beneath me. Then I heard it. A faint scraping noise like something moving. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The noise came again, louder this time, as if something was shifting in the corner. I turned to face the pile of clothes, my body tense with fear. There was no logical explanation for what I was hearing. It couldn't be the clothes. They weren't alive. But that scraping sound was unmistakable. Something was moving, and it was coming from the corner where the clothes lay. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, my body stiff with terror. The scraping grew louder, closer. I opened my mouth to shout, to scream for help, but my voice was trapped in my throat. And then, the clothes shifted. A hand, pale and skeletal, emerged from the bundle, the skin tight against bone, as if the person had been lying here for far too long. The hand reached out, slowly, its fingers curling in the air, like it was searching for something, for me. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, my legs unsteady, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure in the corner moved again, its body creaking as it straightened, its limbs stiff and unnatural. It was no longer just a pile of clothes. It was a person alive, but not alive in the way I understood it. The figure was clothed in tattered layers, but its face was hidden beneath a hood, a dark shadow that seemed to swallow all light. I could see only the faintest outline of its features sunken. Cheeks, hollow eyes, and a mouth that was barely there, a slit in the pale, weathered skin. The scraping noise stopped. And then, the figure spoke. "Help me," it whispered, its voice barely audible above the howling wind outside. It was a soft, broken sound, as if the words had been trapped for a long time, and now that they were free, they were barely more than a raspy breath. I took a step back, my legs shaking. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice a tremor in the silence. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. It was as if it was looking straight through me. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice colder now, sharper. "You'll never leave." I froze, the words sinking into my bones like a chill. I should have run, should have left the igloo and braved the storm. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Fear, yes, but also something else. Morbid curiosity. A need to understand what this thing was, what it wanted. The figure shifted again, this time rising to its feet with a groan that sounded like the creaking of old wood. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it hadn't moved in years. It was too slow to be a human, but too fast for something that had been dead for so long. I turned toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the small flap that would let me escape. But before I could take a step, the figure was in front of me, blocking the only exit. Its hooded face tilted upward, and for the first time I saw its eyes. They were black, hollow pits like two empty sockets, and they were staring directly into mine. I couldn't look away. I felt a pull, a deep, unrelenting force that kept me there, rooted in place. "Leave now," it whispered again, the words so cold they made my bones ache. "Before it's too late." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The wind outside was nothing compared to the freezing terror that gripped me now. The figure raised a hand, and its fingers brushed my cheek, cold as ice, sending a wave of numbness through my skin. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The igloo was empty once more, save for the snow and the quiet. But I knew I wasn't alone. And not anymore. The first thing I noticed was the strange key. It was buried deep in the snow, half covered, as if it had been dropped there by someone or something long ago. I was hiking through the woods, trying to get away from the chaos of life. The snow had been falling lightly all day, covering the trees and the ground in a thick, soft blanket. It was peaceful, almost serene, and I was lost in the quiet of it all when I saw the glint of metal in the distance. At first I thought it might be a discarded piece of old machinery, or perhaps some forgotten tool. But when I got closer, I realized it was far more peculiar than that. The key was frozen solid in a block of ice, its shape intricate and odd, unlike any key I had ever seen. It was not the simple shape you would expect from a door key. This one was ornate with strange markings etched into the metal, giving it an otherworldly appearance. The ice around it had hardened, creating a strange prism, as though whatever it had unlocked was meant to remain hidden. Something about it drew me in. I didn't think twice before I pried the key free from its icy tomb. The cold shot through my hands as I touched it, sending a sharp sting up my arms. But I didn't drop it. Instead, I wrapped my fingers tighter around the handle, feeling a strange sense of urgency building inside me. As I held the key, I noticed something unsettling. The markings on it seemed to shimmer, as if they were alive, constantly shifting and moving. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. I was just cold and tired, that was all. I tucked the key into my pocket, not sure why I felt compelled to take it with me, but something inside me told me it wasn't something I should leave behind. The storm picked up soon after that, the wind howling through the trees and the snow falling in thick sheets. It felt like the entire world was closing in on me. My instincts told me to find shelter, but I wasn't far from the cabin I had rented, so I pressed on, the strange key still weighing heavily in my pocket. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the storm had worsened. The wind was loud and unforgiving, rattling the windows and shaking the door with every gust. I locked myself in, started a fire, and huddled near it for warmth. But the key, the thought of it, wouldn't leave me. Something about it didn't sit right with me. After a few hours, when the fire had burned down low and the wind howled like a thing possessed outside, I couldn't resist anymore. I pulled the key from my pocket and examined it more closely. The markings had grown even more pronounced, glowing faintly in the dim light of the cabin. I could feel the air around me growing heavier, the temperature dropping lower. Despite the fire still crackling in the hearth, it felt wrong, like something was watching me. The idea of using the key became an obsession. I found myself pacing the cabin, my mind racing. What could it open? Why did it seem so important? Eventually, I couldn't ignore the pull any longer. I had to find what it unlocked. I grabbed my jacket and went outside, ignoring the biting cold that gnawed at my skin. The snowstorm had become so thick that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. But I didn't care. My legs moved on their own, taking me further into the woods. I followed a faint trail I had noticed earlier, where the snow seemed disturbed, as though someone had passed through recently. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as though the forest itself had grown quiet, its usual peaceful hum silenced by something unseen. Then I saw it. Hidden beneath a thick layer of snow, there was a door. It was old, ancient even, made of weathered wood and iron, with a large, rusty lock hanging from its frame. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that the key in my pocket, it was meant to open this door. I didn't hesitate. My fingers were shaking as I inserted the strange key into the lock. The moment it clicked open, a rush of cold air blasted through me, as if the door had been sealed for a reason. I stepped back instinctively, but something in me urged me forward. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated only for a moment before I stepped inside. The air down there was thick, the kind of dampness that clung to your skin. There was a faint smell, something musty, almost rotting, and the deeper I went, the stronger it became. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trespassing on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened up into a large chamber. It was lit only by the faint glow of the strange symbols on the walls, symbols that matched the ones on the key. They seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, waiting for something. My breath quickened as I looked around. The chamber was ancient, with cracks running through the stone walls, and what appeared to be remnants of old, long-forgotten rituals. There were strange statues lined against the walls, their faces carved in grotesque shapes, and the floor was littered with broken pieces of old bones and what appeared to be dried, crumbling cloth. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Something in this place felt wrong. It felt alive. And then I heard it, a low, rumbling noise, almost like a growl, but deeper, more guttural. It came from the far corner of the room, behind a heavy curtain of cobwebs. Without thinking, I moved toward the sound, drawn by an unnatural curiosity. The key felt hot in my hand now, as if it was burning against my palm. I pulled the curtain aside. There, in the center of the room, was a stone altar. On top of it lay something alive, a creature, if you could even call it that, writhing beneath layers of ice and bone. Its skin was translucent, showing veins that pulsed with a sickly green light. The thing's eyes were wide open, glowing, with an intense, unnatural light, and it let out a low, tortured wail, as if it had been waiting for me, waiting for the key. I stumbled back in terror, the key slipping from my grasp as I fell to the ground. The air in the chamber grew colder, the very walls seeming to close in on me. The creature on the altar began to move, the ice cracking around it as it slowly rose from the stone. Its eyes never left me. I scrambled to my feet, the horror of what I had just uncovered seeping into my bones. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, the ice-covered walls trapping me in the room. Could feel the cold creeping into my skin, the creature's presence closing in around me. I knew, in that moment, that the key had opened something terrible, and there was no turning back now. The first sign something was wrong came when I noticed my shadow. I was walking through the snow-covered forest, my boots crunching through the fresh powder, the trees towering above me, their bare branches creaking in the wind. It was a peaceful evening, the kind where the only sound is the soft whisper of the snow falling around you. But as I glanced down, I saw it. My shadow wasn't following me. At first, I thought it was just the odd angle of the light, the way the setting sun cast strange patterns on the snow. But no matter how I moved, my shadow stayed still, standing there on the ground as if it had a life of its own. I stopped and looked around, thinking maybe there was someone behind me, casting a shadow where mine should be. But the forest was empty. I tried to shake it off. The snow was starting to fall heavier now, and I had a long walk ahead of me. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave. As I turned back to continue walking, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. My shadow. It was moving. I froze. My heart began to pound as I turned to face it fully. There was no wind to stir it, no reason for it to move on its own. But there it was, stretching and shifting, slowly pulling away from me as though it had a mind of its own. The feeling of dread that washed over me was immediate and overwhelming. I took a step back, unable to tear my eyes away from the eerie movement of my own shadow. Then it did something I'll never forget. It detached itself. My shadow, which had always been there, always a part of me, began to lift from the ground. Separated from my feet, rising up in the air like a dark, liquid stain, stretching and writhing. My breath caught in my throat, my heart racing as I watched in horror. The shadow began to shift and contort, forming into a human-like shape, but it wasn't quite like me. It was distorted, its outline jagged and unnatural, its movements stiff and jerky as if it was learning how to move on its own. And then, with a sudden chilling motion, it began to walk away from me. It moved through the snow, its feet leaving deep prints in the fresh layer of white. Each step it took felt deliberate, as if it knew exactly where it was going. I stood frozen, unable to move, as I watched my own shadow, my own reflection walk away from me, leaving me alone in the gathering dark. It didn't turn to look back at me. It didn't stop. It simply kept walking deeper into the forest, its form fading into the thickening snowstorm. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? Was I hallucinating? No, the air was too cold for that. I could feel the bite of the winter wind against my skin, the sharp sting of the snowflakes against my face. I took a hesitant step forward, the impulse to follow my shadow overwhelming. But as I did, something stopped me. A cold, sinking feeling that spread from the pit of my stomach and twisted its way up into my chest. The sensation of something being wrong, deeply wrong. I couldn't just leave. I had to know what was happening, what had happened. I had to follow. With my heart pounding in my ears, I took off after the shadow, my feet slipping on the ice as I hurried through the snow. I had to catch up with it. I had to make it stop. But the more I ran, the further away it seemed to get. No matter how fast I moved, the shadow stayed just out of reach, moving through the trees like it was being pulled by some invisible force. I lost track of time. The forest around me seemed to warp, the trees blurring together, the snow falling so thickly that it felt like I was moving through a dream. I barely noticed the darkness, creeping in until it was too late. The world around me was black, save for the pale light of the moon shining through the falling snow. And then I heard it. A soft whisper, like a breath, low, insistent, and so familiar. Come. Find me. It was my voice. but it wasn't mine. It was distorted, hollow, like an echo from somewhere deep within the earth. It froze me in my tracks. I turned, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. The whisper seemed to come from all around me, circling me, pushing me to keep going. I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to go back, but I couldn't. My shadow had gone too far. It was calling me now, its voice twisting through the snow, urging me to follow. I pressed on, moving through the blizzard, the cold biting at my skin. But there was no sign of the shadow, no sign of anything except the thick blanket of snow and the whispering wind. The deeper I went into the forest, the more the world around me seemed to fade away, like I was walking into a void. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the woods, bathed in the eerie glow of the moonlight. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my pulse quickening. It was a person. But not just any person. It was the shadow. Standing there, still and motionless, staring back at me with empty, soulless eyes. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I took a step back, my heart thundering in my chest. The figure didn't react. It didn't need to. I could feel the pull of it, the power it had over me. Like it was drawing me in, making me come closer. I couldn't fight it anymore. The darkness, the whispering, the cold, it all pushed me forward. One step after another, until I stood directly in front of it. And then, in the blink of an eye, the shadow reached out with its hands. It didn't touch me. It didn't need to. The moment it extended its arms toward me, I felt the cold seep into my bones. I felt my body freeze, my muscles locking up, as if the shadow had taken control of me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, the shadow whispered once more, but this time it wasn't calling me. You're mine now. And just like that, I was no longer me. It started as a quiet, peaceful evening. I had always heard of the beauty of the northern lights, the way they danced across the sky in vivid, shimmering colors. I had never seen them myself. But tonight the weather was clear, and I felt a strange pull to go out and experience them firsthand. Little did I know, that decision would lead me down a path from which I would never return. The moment I stepped outside, I could see the faint glow of green and purple on the horizon, the lights swirling in patterns that felt almost alive. They were mesmerizing, and I couldn't take my eyes off them. I grabbed my coat and headed toward the open field behind my house, eager to get a better view. The ground was covered in snow, crisp and untouched, the air biting but refreshing. Everything seemed still and perfect. As I walked deeper into the field, the lights above seemed to grow brighter, their glow almost pulling me in. It was as if the very essence of the sky was reaching down, coaxing me to follow. I felt a strange sensation in my chest, a mix of excitement and unease, as I walked further into the wilderness. The snow crunched under my boots, the world eerily quiet except for the whispering wind. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop myself. Every step seemed to draw me deeper, further, away from the safety of my home, into the unknown. The lights shifted, almost beckoning me. Their colors more vibrant now, swirling in patterns that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. It felt like they were calling to me, urging me forward, and I couldn't resist. Minutes turned into hours, or maybe it was just the surreal feeling of the night stretching on forever. The landscape around me was barren, but I kept moving, my feet carrying me toward the lights that seemed just out of reach. The further I went, the colder the air became. The snow beneath my boots turned to ice, slick and treacherous. But I didn't care. I was so focused on the lights above that nothing else seemed to matter. I didn't realize how far I had walked until I looked around and found myself surrounded by a forest. The trees were bare, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, clawing at the sky. The northern lights above had shifted, now glowing a deep red, casting an eerie, unnatural light across the snow-covered ground. It felt wrong, like the world had turned upside down and I was no longer in control. But I couldn't turn back now. The lights, they were calling to me. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My heart began to race as I walked deeper into the forest. Every step felt heavier, the air thick with an unsettling pressure. I couldn't see anyone or anything, but I felt like I was being watched. A chill ran down my spine, and I shivered despite the heavy coat I wore. I should have turned back. But the lights, they were so close now, so close I could almost touch them. I walked faster, my breath coming out in sharp gasps. The world around me seemed to warp as I moved, the trees bending in impossible angles, the shadows lengthening and twisting, unnaturally. Suddenly, the lights above vanished. For a moment, there was only darkness. The cold seemed to deepen, pressing in on me from all sides, and the silence was deafening. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse pounding in my ears. My breath was visible in the freezing air, but there was something else now, something wrong. The darkness around me was thick, suffocating. It was as if the forest had swallowed me whole. Then I heard it. A voice, soft at first, but unmistakable. A whisper, like wind through dry leaves. It called my name. I spun around, looking desperately for the source, but there was nothing there. No one. The snow crunched under my boots as I took a step backward, my mind racing. Was I hallucinating? Was I imagining things? No, this felt too real. The voice came again, this time louder, more urgent, and I froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was my own. Come closer, it whispered, echoing from every direction. I stepped back, my heart pounding harder, my mind screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. It was as if my body had been paralyzed, frozen by some unseen force. The trees around me groaned as if they were alive, the air now thick with an oppressive weight. I could feel something watching me from the darkness. You should never have followed, the voice continued, this time from behind me. I spun around, my eyes wide with terror, but no one was there. The trees, the snow, the icy ground, everything was still, but I could feel the presence of something that wasn't. Suddenly, a flicker of light returned, far in the distance, deep in the forest. The northern lights, once again. But they were different now. The colors were dark, twisted, their glow sickly and unnatural. I had to go toward them, I knew that. But my body refused to move. I was trapped, immobilized by fear. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the distance, shrouded in the twisted glow of the lights. It was tall, almost. Impossibly so, with features that seemed to shift and change with each blink of my eyes. Its outline was blurred like a shadow, but with eyes, so many eyes. They gleamed red, glowing, like embers, and they were all focused on me. The figure stood motionless, watching. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt dry, constricted. I was choking on the cold, on the fear, on the darkness around me. And still the voice kept whispering, this time in a tone so cold it cut through the night. It's too late. You should have stayed home. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I had no idea where I was going, but I had to get away. The snow beneath me was now slick with ice, making each step more treacherous than the last. The trees seemed to close in on me, their twisted limbs reaching out like hands, blocking my path. Every direction I took seemed to lead me deeper into the forest, further from any sign of escape. The wind howled around me, carrying whispers, voices that I couldn't understand but that seemed to pierce my mind, pulling me toward something. And then the ground gave way. Beneath me. I stumbled, falling into a deep, freezing pit that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The snow had been hiding it, covering it like a trap, and now I was falling, tumbling into the cold darkness. Below, I landed hard, my body slamming into something soft yet solid. When I opened my eyes, the northern lights were gone, and I was no longer in the forest. I was trapped in some kind of cave, the walls shimmering with ice, the whispering voices filled, the space swirling around me like a storm. And the worst part? I could still feel those eyes on me, the eyes of that figure, watching from somewhere deep in the shadows. I had followed the lights, and now I was lost in a nightmare from which there was no escape. It was a day like any other, or at least it seemed that way at first. The snow had been falling all morning, blanketing everything in a thick layer of white. It was the kind of snow that made the world look quiet, soft, and still. The kind of snow that made you feel like you could escape from everything, just for a little while. I needed that escape. I had been out walking, trying to clear my mind, when I noticed it. A small, dark shape in the distance, half buried in the snow. I didn't think much of it at first. People lose things all the time. In the snow, right? Gloves, scarves, hats, nothing unusual. But as I got closer, something about the way it sat there, unmoving, caught my attention. It was a single glove, lying in the snow. It was black, made of soft leather, with a small tear near in the knuckles. No one else was around. The snow was fresh, untouched except for my own footprints. Whoever had dropped it had been long gone, or so I thought. I reached down to pick it up, my fingers brushing against the cold leather. But as soon as my hand made contact, I felt a strange shiver run up my arm. It wasn't the cold. It was something else. A sensation I couldn't quite place, like the glove was, waiting for something, or someone. Then it moved. At first it was a slight twitch, almost imperceptible. My hand froze just inches above it. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a small animal, but deep down I knew it wasn't. There was no wind here, and the area was too remote for any animals to wander so far into the open field. I stared at the glove, unsure of what I was seeing. It twitched again, this time more noticeably, as if the leather itself had come to life. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to drop it and run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, my gaze locked onto the glove as it began to move on its own, as if being manipulated by some invisible force. It shifted, slowly dragging itself across the snow, leaving a faint trail behind it. I couldn't breathe. I reached out instinctively, but the glove jerked away from my fingers, moving faster, as if it was actively avoiding me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The glove wasn't just moving. It was alive. I stumbled backward, my mind racing to find a logical explanation. Was it some kind of prank? Had someone set up some hidden mechanism to make it move? But I couldn't see anything. No wires, no strings, nothing that could explain this. It was just the glove, sliding through the snow. On its own. My feet finally found the strength to move, and I turned to run. But something held me back. A low, deep sound echoed in the distance, like a faint whisper carried by the wind. It was a voice. A soft, unintelligible voice, but it felt familiar. I felt it in my chest, vibrating through my ribs. The air grew colder, even though I hadn't noticed it getting any colder before. As I tried to take another step, the snow beneath me seemed to shift, almost as if the ground itself was alive, shifting under my weight. My legs faltered, and I stumbled, falling into the snow. My heart pounded in my ears. I tried to push myself up, but the snow felt heavier than before, like it was pulling me down. And then I heard the glove, the soft sound of leather scraping across the snow, getting closer. I whipped my head around, eyes wide, but I couldn't see it. The glove had vanished. Just gone. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, my breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. I knew I had to leave. I didn't care where I was or how I got here. I needed to get out, far away from whatever that thing was. I began to run, stumbling over the snowdrifts, my feet slipping and sliding. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The glove. It was no longer in the distance. It was right there at the edge of my vision, moving in the snow like it had been waiting for me to look away. And then it was gone again. I turned in circles, searching for it, but it never stayed in one place long enough for me to focus on it. It was as though it was following me, getting closer every time I blinked. My breaths were sharp, the cold air biting at my throat as I ran, but it didn't matter. I had to get away. Finally, I reached the edge of the field, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I thought I was safe. I was wrong. I looked down at my right hand, and froze. The glove. It was on my hand, as if it had been placed there while I wasn't looking. The leather felt warm against my skin, but there was something wrong about it. The glove was tighter than it should have been, constricting, the fingers almost too small. The more I tried to pull it off, the tighter it became, like it was gripping my hand with an unnatural strength. The whispering voice came again, but this time it was clearer, closer. "You shouldn't have touched it," it said. I pulled at the glove, panic flooding my veins. I could feel something moving inside it, like fingers that weren't mine, curling against my skin. I heard the crackling of leather, the sound of it, shifting and changing shape. It felt like it was alive, a part of me, but not. Something was inside it, something that didn't belong. And then I heard the crunch of snow, slow, deliberate steps behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't let go, the voice whispered. "Colder now. It's too late." In a moment of sheer desperation, I ripped the glove off with all my strength. My hand burned as I pulled it free, the fingers aching, as if the glove had been draining something from me. My breath was ragged, my heart racing. I looked at the glove, now lying motionless in the snow. But I wasn't alone. Standing before me, at the edge of the field, was a figure. A man, dressed in a long, dark coat. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his gaze on me, like he knew everything about me. He stepped forward, the snow crunching under his boots, his movements deliberate, slow. The glove, lying still at his feet, twitched once, as if acknowledging him. "It's never over," the voice whispered, and I realized then that it wasn't just the glove speaking. It was him. He had been the one guiding me, pulling me in. With a final glance at the glove, I turned and ran, not daring to look back. But even as I fled, I could still hear the whispering, soft and persistent, as if the snow itself had come alive to chase me. I would never be the same after today. The glove. It never truly left me, and the man, the one who had been behind it all, was still waiting. Somewhere. Always waiting. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the sky a dark, bruised purple as the biting cold seeped into my bones. I was walking home through the woods after a long day at work, the path barely visible under the thick blanket of snow. The world was quiet, too quiet. The crunch of my boots in the snow was the only sound that filled the air, and it felt as though everything around me was holding its breath. I've walked this trail countless times before, but tonight felt different. The air was too still, the kind of stillness that makes your skin prickle with unease. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I pulled my coat tighter around me, trying to ward off the chill that was creeping into my bones. I paused for a moment, looking around the woods. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, and the path ahead seemed endless in the dim light. But then, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. At the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin, I saw a figure. It was tall, too tall, and it was moving toward me. The snow around it seemed to shimmer, as though the air itself was colder, more frigid. The figure was wrapped in something that made it appear almost frozen, its outline jagged and distinct, as though the ice had shaped it from nothing. I couldn't make out its face only the outline of what looked like a hood, obscured in layers of frost. A shiver ran through me, and I instinctively took a step back. But the figure didn't stop. It continued to move toward me with an unsettling purpose. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't bound by the same laws of nature as everything else in the world. The snow beneath it didn't crunch or shift. It just passed over it, as if the figure was part of the cold itself. I should have turned and run. I should have fled back the way I came, but I couldn't. My body felt frozen in place, my mind racing for an explanation. A trick of the light? A figment of my imagination. But no, this was real. I could feel it. The air grew colder with each step the figure took, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, as if I were being watched by something ancient, something that had no business being in this world. The figure was closer now, and I could see the details more clearly. It was wrapped in layers of ice, the frozen tendrils curling around its form like some monstrous cocoon. The ice seemed to pulse with a faint glow, casting eerie reflections in the snow. Its arms hung limply at its sides, encased in the same frost, and its legs moved with the stiffness of someone or something who hadn't walked in years. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching me, studying me. The air felt charged, heavy, as with a presence that made it impossible to think clearly. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were like lead, frozen to the ground. The closer the figure got, the colder it became. The snow around me grew thicker, swirling in an unnatural gust. I could feel the temperature drop, a bitter chill sinking into my skin, my bones. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like the creaking of ice cracking under pressure, emanating from the figure. It was a sound that shouldn't exist, a noise that sent a jolt of terror straight through me. My breath caught in my throat as the figure took another step toward me, its frozen form looming over me. The world around us seemed to vanish. The trees, the snow, the path, all of it faded into the fog background as I stood there, locked in place by fear. The figure didn't say a word, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me like a weight. The air itself seemed to be suffocating, thick, with cold and dread. And then, as it reached me, it stopped. It was so close now, I could almost feel the chill radiating off of it. Its eyes, if they were even, eyes were hidden beneath the hood of ice. But I could feel its gaze, a stare that seemed to pierce straight through me, deep into my soul. It was as if it was trying to pull something from me, some part of myself that I didn't know I had lost. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, and the world felt like it was holding its breath. I thought I was going to freeze right then and there, unable to move, unable to think, as the figure stood there in front of me, wrapped in ice. And then, without warning, it lifted one of its frozen arms. Slowly, painfully, the ice cracked and creaked, the sound unbearable in the stillness of the night. My eyes widened in horror as I realized the figure was reaching toward me, its frozen hand outstretched, as if it were going to touch me. That's when I finally snapped out of my trance. My body, still stiff with fear, surged with adrenaline. I didn't think, I just reacted. I turned and ran as fast as I could, without looking back. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I sprinted through the foreign snow, my legs burning with the effort. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just had to get away. The sound of my boots crunching in the snow was the only thing I could hear, and then, over the sound of my own breathing, I heard it again. The figure's slow, deliberate steps, coming closer, growing louder with each passing moment. It was chasing me. I ran faster, my vision blurry from the cold and the fear. I didn't know how far I had gone or how long I had been running, but the sound of its pursuit was relentless. The figure was still behind me, getting closer, its frozen form moving with the eerie precision of something that had all the time in the world. Then, Just as I thought I couldn't go any farther, I stumbled. My feet caught in a patch of snow, and I went down hard, my body slamming into the ground. I tried to push myself up, but I was too slow. Before I could react, the figure was there. It was towering over me, its icy hand reaching down toward me, its presence so overwhelming that I couldn't breathe. I closed my eyes, waiting for the cold to consume me. But then, everything stopped. The world grew still again. The snow stopped falling, the wind stopped howling. And when I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. There was no trace of it, no sign it had ever been there. I lay there in the snow, trembling, my heart racing. The path was empty. The woods were silent. I was alone. Wah. Or at least that's what I told myself as I staggered to my feet and ran the rest of the way home. It was late afternoon when I first saw it. The sky was heavy with snow, thick flakes swirling in the air, and the cold had a way of sinking straight through my coat and into my bones. The world around me was blanketed in white, with the snowdrifts rising higher and higher as I trudged through the woods, trying to make my way back home. My footsteps were the only sound, breaking the stillness, and the trees stood silent and unmoving, like statues in the snow. I had been out for hours, getting lost in the tranquility of it all. The woods were quiet, peaceful. Yet there was something about the silence that felt unnerving, like the world was holding its breath. I pushed the uneasy feeling aside, focusing on the path ahead of me, my mind lost in thought. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another snowman, one of those simple, round creations that people often leave in their yards, but something about it caught my attention. It stood alone, nestled at the edge of the trees, with its large, snow-covered body towering over the ground. Its eyes, two black buttons, glittered in the dim light, and its crooked smile was made of thin twigs. The snow around it was undisturbed, as if it had just appeared there, waiting for someone to notice. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the snowman. There was something about it that felt wrong. Its shape, the way it stood there so perfectly, was almost too precise. But what really made my blood run cold was the feeling that crept up my spine. There was something familiar about it. Something about the way the snowman was formed. Something about the placement of the branches that made up its arms made it feel as though it had been made for a reason, not just as a casual winter decoration. I took a cautious step closer, my breath coming out in visible puffs, forming clouds in the freezing air. I wasn't sure why, but I had to see it up close. My heart was beating faster now, my thoughts tangled in confusion. The snowman didn't make sense. It was too perfect. As I stepped closer, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. There was a small patch of snow beneath its feet that had been disturbed, as if something had recently been dragged through it. The marks were faint, barely noticeable beneath the fresh layer of snow, but they were there. The ground was soft underfoot, and as I knelt down to examine the tracks more closely, a wave of dread washed over me. The tracks weren't just random. They were deliberate. They led from the trees to the snowman. And then, nowhere. It was as if someone had carefully placed the snowman there, and then vanished, leaving nothing behind. I straightened up quickly, a sense of panic rising in my chest. My mind raced with thoughts of why this felt so wrong, why I felt so uneasy, and that's when it hit me. The snowman's face. It was familiar. The crooked smile, thin branches arranged with a level of care that didn't seem like a child's work. The eyes, black buttons that gleamed with a strange intensity. The shape of the nose, slightly tilted, like a person's face. It was all too familiar. I didn't want to believe it, but I had no choice. The face, the smile, the shape, everything about. The snowman reminded me of someone I used to know, someone who had been a part of my life, and someone who was no longer around, my older brother. I felt the blood drain from my face. It couldn't be, could it? But as I stared at the snowman, I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer. The face, the way the snow had been shaped, it was as if someone had intentionally created it to resemble him. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. My brother had died a year ago. A car accident. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. No warning. No goodbyes. Just a phone call in the middle of the night, and the world had been turned upside down. I had never fully processed his death, not in the way I should have. I avoided visiting his grave. Never really talked about him, and I certainly didn't expect to see him again, at least not like this. But standing there looking at the snowman, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a coincidence. It was as if it was made in his image, as if the snowman was mocking me, forcing me to remember something I didn't want to face. I took a step back, my breath quickening. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was spinning with disbelief. I wanted to run, to turn around and flee from the woods and the snowman, but my legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in the snow. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the snowman's face. Suddenly I heard something. A faint sound, barely audible over the wind. It was a soft noise, a whisper almost, but it was enough to make me freeze in place. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I listened, my body tense with anticipation. The whisper grew louder, and I realized it was a voice I knew all too well. "Why did you leave me?" the voice said. My breath caught in my throat. It was my brother's voice, the one I had heard so many times growing up. It wasn't just in my head. It was real. The voice came from the snowman, or perhaps from the very air around me, and the words sent a chill through my entire body. I took a step back, my heart racing. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The snowman stood, motionless, its frozen features staring at me. But I could hear the voice clearly now, echoing in my mind. "Why did you leave me behind?" the voice repeated, this time louder, more urgent. "You didn't even try to save me." The words hit me like a physical blow. My legs gave way, and I stumbled back, barely catching myself on a nearby tree. My head spun as the memories flooded back my brother's face, his laughter, the way we used to play in the snow together when we were kids. And then, the accident, the guilt, the overwhelming sense of not being there when he needed me most. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I never wanted you to go." The snowman's smile seemed to widen ever so slightly. The voice laughed, but it wasn't my brother's laughter anymore. It was something darker, colder, filled with an endless sorrow. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the voice stopped. The smile faded, and the snowman stood still once again, just as it had before. The world around me grew quiet, the wind ceasing to howl. I didn't stay long enough to question what had just happened. My legs finally responded, and I turned, running as fast as I could through the snow, my heart still pounding in my chest. The woods felt darker now, more oppressive, and I didn't dare look back. When I finally made it home, I slammed the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, my breath ragged, my hands shaking. I couldn't make sense of what I had just seen, what I had heard. I was shaken, terrified, and yet, deep down, I knew that the snowman had been no accident. It had been a message I was not ready to understand. It started as a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like a soft breeze passing through the trees. But it was different from any wind I'd ever heard before. It wasn't just the rustling of leaves or the whisper of branches swaying. It had a rhythm, a tone, a melody. Something about it felt intentional, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with me. I had been walking through the snow-covered forest for hours, my boots crunching with each step as I made my way back home. The world around me was blanketed in white, the snow falling gently, the air sharp and biting. There wasn't a soul around, and the only sounds were the wind and the occasional creak of tree branches. I had been out there too long, wandering aimlessly, trying to clear my mind after a difficult week. The silence of the woods had always been comforting to me, a place where I could think, without distractions. But today it felt different. The air was heavier, colder, and the silence seemed oppressive, like something was lurking just beyond the trees. That's when I first heard it, the soft whistle. It was distant at first, like someone blowing on a flute, but then it grew clearer, sharper. It sounded like the wind, but with a tune. And as it grew louder, I thought I could hear something else beneath it, my name, Anna. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The voice, if you could even call it that, was barely audible over the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was my name. I turned, looking around, but there was no one there. Just the snow, the trees, and the ever-deepening silence. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. It was just the wind, I thought. Just my mind playing tricks on me. I kept walking, my pace quickening as I tried to ignore the strange feeling creeping up my spine. But the whistle continued, growing louder and more distinct with each passing second. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was deliberate, as if someone was trying to get my attention. Anna, the voice whispered again, this time closer, clearer. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped in my tracks, my legs suddenly heavy, like I was rooted to the spot. I turned slowly, scanning the empty woods. The trees swayed gently, their branches heavy with snow, but there was no one there. No one in sight. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if something was watching me, waiting for me to respond. I took a hesitant step forward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whistle seemed to beckon me, pulling me deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to part just enough to reveal a narrow path, one that hadn't been there before. I hadn't noticed it when I first started my walk, but now it seemed to open up before me, inviting me in. I couldn't resist. There was something about the sound, something about the way it called to me, that I couldn't ignore. It felt almost like a compulsion, like I had no choice but to follow it. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped into the path, my feet crunching in the fresh snow, the whistle guiding me forward. The air grew colder as I walked, the snow falling heavier, as if the world around me was closing in. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisted and gnarled, creating shadows that seemed to shift in the corner of my vision. The path grew narrower, the snow deeper, until it felt like I was walking through a tunnel of white. And still, the whistle continued, always just ahead, always calling my name. Anna. I wanted to turn back. I wanted to run. But something held me in place. The whistle was soothing. Now, almost comforting, as if it knew exactly what I needed. I pressed on, my legs aching with each step, the cold seeping deeper into my bones. The further I went, the more the world around me seemed to disappear. The trees blurred into darkness, the snow became a hazy white mist, and the whistle became the only sound, echoing through the silence like a siren's call. Finally, after what felt like hours, I emerged into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a figure. It was draped in snow, the outlines of its form barely visible against the whiteness of the landscape. But I could see it. I could feel it. It was watching me. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The whistle had stopped, and all I could hear now was my own breath, sharp and ragged in the cold air. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, but I could feel its gaze. It was as if it was waiting for me to do something, waiting for me to make the next move. I took another step, my feet sinking deeper into the snow. The world seemed to slow around me, the air thick with tension. And then, as if on cue, the figure raised its head. It wasn't a person. It wasn't human. Its face was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, if you could call them, that were nothing more than hollow sockets. A thin smile stretched across its face, twisted and wrong. Its skin was covered in a thin layer of frost, and its breath came out in visible puffs, misting the air around it. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with the same whistle I had been hearing all along. It was a sound, a tone, a call. "Come closer, Anna." I froze. The voice, if you could even call it, that was haunting, but it was also familiar. It was the same whistle that had been calling me through the woods. The same melody that had drawn me here. I wanted to turn and run. I wanted to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure raised its hand, fingers long and skeletal, pointing directly at me. "Anna, come closer. You belong here." My heart raced in my chest, my mind screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear myself away. I stepped forward, my feet moving of their own accord, pulling me closer to the creature, closer to the thing that had been calling me all along. As I took the final step, the world around me shifted. The snow, the trees, the clearing, it all began to melt away, as if the landscape itself was dissolving. The figure's hollow eyes fixed on me, its smile widening, and the air grew colder still. And then the whistle stopped. The world went silent. I stood there, in the freezing cold, alone. The creature, the figure, the whistle, it was all gone. I was back in the forest, standing in the fog, same spot where I had first heard the call. But something had changed. The woods were darker. Now, the snow falling heavier, and the air felt different. It felt wrong. And then I heard it again. Soft at first, a whisper on the wind. But this time it wasn't just my name. Carl. It was the sound of 1,000 whispers, all calling me Anna. And deep down, I knew that no matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, I would always hear it, always be drawn back. The snow had claimed me, and I would never escape. The cold hit me as soon as I stepped into the snow-covered wilderness. The air was biting, sharp, enough to freeze your breath in midair. I had been hiking for hours, lost in the quiet beauty of the winter landscape. The snow lay thick on the ground, untouched and pure. The world felt still, as though frozen in time, and for the first time in days I felt like I could breathe easy. I had been struggling with stress and the weight of life's demands, so I decided to take a break, get away from everything. I set up my tent in a small clearing, the snow gently falling around me. I made a fire and sat there for a while, just listening to the crackling of the wood and watching the stars begin to emerge in the crisp, cold sky. By the time the fire burned down to embers, I felt the overwhelming urge to rest. I crawled into the warmth of my sleeping bag, the cold creeping in from the edges, but it felt manageable. The fire had died, and the wind outside began to howl, but I didn't mind. It was peaceful in here, warm enough for now. The sound of the snowstorm outside only added to the feeling of isolation. I fell asleep quickly, the darkness wrapping around me, but something was wrong. Even in the comfort of my tent, I felt a strange sense of unease, like I wasn't alone. The wind howled outside, but inside it was quiet, almost too quiet. At some point in the night, I woke up to a soft noise. A gentle scratching, almost like nails running over fabric. I tried to shake off the grogginess of sleep, but the noise was persistent. My heart began to race. I knew the wind was strong, but this sound was different. I sat up, my breath shallow in the cold air. I glanced around the tent, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. I reached for the flashlight I kept beside me and flicked it on. Nothing. The tent was exactly how I left it, the walls taut against the weight of the snow outside. My pulse slowed, and I lay back down, convincing myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Something wasn't right. Eventually, I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. But it wasn't the kind of sleep where you rest. No, it was a deep, suffocating kind of sleep, where reality and nightmare blurred together. I woke up again, but this time it wasn't the sound that startled me. It was the feeling the air had changed. The warmth of the sleeping bag was gone, replaced with an unbearable chill that clung to my skin. I opened my eyes, but the tent didn't look the same. It was no longer just a small, temporary shelter. It felt much larger now, as if I had somehow shrunk, or the space around me had expanded in some unnatural way. The snow was still falling outside, but the sky was a sickly yellow, as if the world had taken on a strange, otherworldly hue. A cold, eerie silence filled the air, the kind of silence that presses in on you, suffocating, making your heart race. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but it didn't help. It was colder than before, the temperature dropping rapidly. I shivered and turned to look out of the tent's opening. The snow had stopped falling, and the world beyond was dark, but it wasn't the same forest I had camped in. The trees that had once surrounded me were now twisted and gnarled, their branches curling like claws, their bark blackened and scarred. The ground was no longer soft snow, but frozen earth, cracked and uneven. My eyes darted around, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Something was waiting. I scrambled to my feet, my breath forming visible clouds in the air. The chill was unbearable now, and the air had a sharp, metallic taste to it. My chest tightened as panic began to claw at me. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this place, whatever it was. I unzipped the tent, but the sight outside stopped me dead in my tracks. The snow-covered ground was now littered with strange shapes, shadows that moved, shifting and writhing, beneath the layer of snow. I couldn't see them clearly, but I knew they weren't just piles of snow. They were something else, something unnatural. I stepped back, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I couldn't understand what was happening. One moment, I had been in the comfort of my tent, trying to sleep off my exhaustion. Now, I was standing in a nightmare, trapped in a world that wasn't mine. Suddenly, I heard a noise. A low growl coming from somewhere in the distance. It wasn't the wind. It was something alive, something hungry. My body froze in fear, and I couldn't move. Couldn't think. I was paralyzed, unable to comprehend what was happening to me. The growl came again, louder this time. And then, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human. It wasn't even a recognizable creature. It was a shape, an unnatural mass of darkness, with glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce through the night. Its form shifted and twisted like smoke or shadows, but solid, like it was made of darkness itself. The air around it grew colder, the snow beneath it freezing and turning to ice. It moved toward me, slow but deliberate, its red eyes locked on mine. I couldn't look away. Couldn't run. My body was frozen, paralyzed in place. The creature's growl grew louder, and as it neared, I could see its mouth, wide and filled with jagged, broken teeth. My heart raced, pounding in my chest, as it stepped closer. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. My vision began to blur, my surroundings spinning, and the world seemed to fold in on itself. And then, I woke up. I sat up with a gasp, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and my entire body was soaked in sweat. The tent was still there, just as it had been before. The fire outside had died down, and the world beyond was silent. The snow was still falling gently, the wind howling as it always did, but something was wrong. The air inside the tent was too still. The cold was unbearable, seeping through the fabric, and my breath formed visible clouds before me. I glanced around, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift in the corner of the tent. My eyes went wide, my breath caught in my throat. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I heard it again. That growl. It came from outside the tent, low and menacing. I froze, not daring to move. The growl grew louder, and then a sound I recognized, the scraping of claws against the snow. The snow-covered landscape outside the tent was no longer peaceful. It was a dark, twisted world, full of shadows and horrors I couldn't escape. The creature was out there, waiting for me. I crawled to the entrance of the tent, trembling in fear. My fingers fumbled with the zipper, but it was stuck. The cold was seeping through the fabric, making my skin feel as if it were freezing too. The bone. The growl came closer, and then I heard it. A voice, low and guttural, whispering from the darkness. Kia, come outside, Anna. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just knew one thing. I wasn't alone.